right. Hello, everyone. And this is Ruth Lindroos. And with me is Dr. Martin James Turner, who is a sports and performance psychologist, best known for his work integrating the Rational Emotive Behaviour Therapy into elite performance settings. And you've won multiple awards, including the Albert Ellis Award, and also beyond the academy, you are working with performers in different settings, including elite sports, the military, executives, helping people to navigate the settings of high pressure. And as a psychologist, understanding how adversity and high stress affect individual psychology, performance, and well-being. So that was a short introduction from me. Is there something you would like to add?
No, thank you. Yeah, it's good introduction. Good to be with you again, having a conversation. Excited to get started, really, and pick up on these interesting points that we've got planned.
As a short recap, we recorded our first podcast together on our work with developing the Rational Sport Coaching Framework. And I'm not going to spend too much time on that because also today we have a lot of interesting and big subjects coming up. So instead, I'm just going to link the podcast 1 to the description of this video. So listeners can then directly go to and listen to it fully themselves. But
Yeah, makes
now
sense.
here in podcast 2, we're going to dive way deeper into the world of emotions and emotional regulation and emotional life in high pressure settings.
Yeah, indeed.
Yes.
Yeah.
And I am greatly looking forward to this podcast also with you. So our first theme or subject is emotional suppression, which can actually be seen perhaps somewhat the opposite of emotional regulation or healthy emotional regulation. But the reason I wanted to start off with emotional suppression is that I feel that sometimes when I'm looking and observing people in different environments, they can confuse this emotional awareness to mean in some way being above emotions and thus turning to emotional suppression, trying to push emotions down or away from themselves in order to kind of keep a cool or keep a strong face when the pressure rises. And well, I think first we can start off with what is then emotional suppression. So maybe you, a psychologist, can open that up.
Well, yeah, I was going to ask you really in relation to that, what do you think the motivation is for a performer to suppress an emotion? What's the reason they would do that?
I think a performer, like I'm thinking right now, like sports specific performance, but it can also be in other industries, such as, for example, an executive having a very important presentation or something like this. I think maybe one motivation would be that they see emotions as something bad that are going to mess up their performance, and thus they're going to try to get rid of them fast.
Yeah. Yeah. And I actually think even before you get to that point, because that's using kind of reasoning and logic in a way, it's saying, well, okay, is this emotion going to help me or hinder me? Even before you get to that, it's the unpleasantness of many of the emotions that I think is the sort of like stimulus of suppression, or just feeding you motivation to do something about that emotion. Like it feels bad. It feels unpleasant to be anxious and to be sad and to be angry and upset. And I think that fuels that kind of desire and drive to suppress the emotion. How can I get rid of this emotion quickly? Now, one option is suppression. Now, it's important to say that it's not that suppression itself is like ineffective. It obviously works. You can suppress your emotion. It's one option that you have. It's just that in performance environments, often suppressing isn't the best course of action, that there are better options that we have, and options that have less downsides to suppression, because suppression does have a few downsides which we can talk about and think about.
Yes, definitely. And one thought that occurred to me now when you were talking, this capability to experience, express, and evolve through our emotions is one of the most important tools and skills we can obtain in our lives, because emotions are not really something that you can get rid of like by talking your way out of them. It's something that, well, when they exist, they will persist, kind of thing. But when I think that, okay, it's one of the top skills can be learning to regulate our emotions in a healthy way, but still it's not something that is taught to us
Mm.
in our school system growing up, or at least not here in Finland where I reside. Like, on the contrast, if we think about somebody, a child or a youth expressing their emotions in a very authentic and raw way, it's usually something that would be seen as disobedient and bad and quickly try to shut it down. So it was just a thought to me that could maybe this kind of programming also be a reason that we feel that experiencing heavy emotions is something uncomfortable.
Yeah, and in sport in particular, many young athletes are taught not to express emotion, and that expressing
Mm.
emotion is a bad thing. Now, within REBT, we see it slightly differently. We see negative emotion as not something that should be suppressed or dampened necessarily. We kind of try to understand emotion from a functional and dysfunctional perspective.
Yes.
So you would start to try to um, experience and express emotion in the way that's actually helpful for that context. You wouldn't try to reduce emotion necessarily, or get rid of the emotion. You
Mm.
know, you would try to still have that emotional intensity, but make sure it's directed towards the right place, towards something that's
Yeah.
useful in your performance environment. But the motivation is often to get rid of the emotion and to reduce the emotion, which A, is not possible and
Mm.
costs you a lot of time and energy, and B, doesn't work because, yes, it might remove the emotion in the short term,
Mm.
but in the longer term, evidence suggests that those thoughts, those emotions are going to spring back. They're going to come back. There's no getting rid of emotions. There's no getting rid of thoughts, because where are they going to go? You can't extract them and throw them away. So the evidence around this, sometimes called ironic processes, and people listening will be familiar with the language of that. So don't mess up, don't worry, don't be anxious. This tends not to work very well. And we call that thought suppression. So if you're sitting there before, say, for example, your illustration there was, say, a big presentation, an important pitch. You're sitting there saying, don't be anxious. The likelihood is it's going to make you more anxious. So
Yeah.
you trying to suppress actually has the opposite effect. And whilst you're sitting there trying to suppress and spend your effort and energy trying to suppress, you're stealing effort and energy from places you could put it that might be more useful and lead to more functional outcomes.
Mm.
So whilst it's tempting to suppress because its emotions are unpleasant, and there might be the belief that emotion might not help me, it's tempting to do that, and it can help you in the short term. In the longer term, it's not the best strategy to go with.
Yeah. Would you say that there are any consequences with long-term emotional suppression? Like, is it something habitual that can start to leak into your other areas of life if you kind of obtain it as a strategy?
Yeah, well, what you're doing is you're not integrating your, let's call it your emotional life, with the self. You're basically
Mm.
saying that this is separate to me. It's something I don't want. It's something I don't want to experience. So I'm going to try to remove it. Well, it's part of what makes you a human being. So sustaining that suppression becomes very difficult, but also just catches up with you because those are unexpressed emotions, and you end up compensating somewhere. It ends up affecting your life somewhere else. So for example, you might be a performer who constantly suppressing your anger and frustration with the way things are done in the organization. Let's say, for example, the likelihood is you take that frustration and anger that you suppressed in the organization, say at training or in meetings, and you take it home, and then it affects your relationships with others. You start to treat them differently. So you can't ever just remove emotion. It's going to appear at some point, and if you suppress, then it's going to sometimes appear stronger. So whilst in this context, you might say, "Oh, I got through that situation and I wasn't angry. I didn't let my aggression overspill." That usually catches up with you, and you end up showing that somewhere else, often in environments that aren't that performance context, and then the people around you suffer as well. And then over a long period of time, that can affect relationships and can affect your personal well-being. Whilst it might be effective in the performance environment to do that, for a short period of time, it's going to start affecting things at a personal level, and then that feeds back into performance. The opposite of suppression is cathartic release, and that ends up not being an effective strategy either. And I've worked my fair share of athletes who respond to frustration by kicking things and kicking water bottles and punching stuff. That doesn't work either. You release that emotion in the moment, but the problem is the next time something frustrates you, all you're teaching yourself to do is express the emotion in an inappropriate manner. So you're looking for a strategy, a way to regulate emotion that is different to suppression, but is not just outward cathartic expression of the emotion, because that can be bad too. So it's tricky. You got to try and find a sweet spot.
Yeah. Going back to the practical example that if you are an executive or a person who is preparing for an important presentation and in the moment are getting incredibly anxious about it or have a tendency to be anxious in these scenarios, what would you say could be like a practical strategy in directing that anxiety in the moment if we don't suppress it?
Well, it comes back to your kind of first comment really in this conversation around how you see that emotion. These emotions are naturally occurring. They are within you. It's part of you. It's part of who you are as a human being, is to express and feel negative emotion, and of course positive emotion, but positive emotion less frequently and often less intensely as negative emotion. We seem to be specifically tuned for negative emotion, partly because it helped us with survival. So when you're going into that situation that feels like a big deal for you, a pitch, or you're taking a penalty, or you're taking an exam, whatever it is, your body is reacting to that as kind of like an existential threat, almost. Like physiologically, the same things are taking place as if you were trying to run for your life, or you're coming up against, an existential issue. So that's normal and natural. And that's kind of, I think, the first step is almost like acceptance, not passive acceptance, but more like just acknowledgement of reality. This is the reality. This is what my body is. This is what it does. When something is important, I have these sensations and feelings and thoughts. Okay. Then the next step is to say, well, actually, this could help me. There are aspects of this which might help me in this situation. It will help me to pay attention more. It will give me the energy to perform. It will help me to really stay on my toes and be switched on to certain things and situations. To go into an important situation without any anxiety, perhaps you'd be flat, and perhaps you wouldn't be sharp, and perhaps you wouldn't pay attention to the right things. So partly it's about reframing that emotion to be something that A, is normal and natural, and B, potentially helpful. So that would be part of it. The REBT part of this would be more like, well, I'm experiencing this emotion. Well, there was no reason to suspect that this would affect my performance negatively.
Mm.
How am I appraising this emotion? Well, okay, I'm, feels unpleasant. Well, I can tolerate it. It's not the end of the world. Oh, I shouldn't be anxious. Well, okay, you don't want to be anxious in this moment, maybe, but there's no should or shouldn't. And it doesn't say anything about you as a human being. All it says is that you're anxious at the moment, or you're experiencing anxiety. Even the language that we use, I am anxious, is inappropriate. The only thing you are is a human being. You're not anxious. You're not that thing. So you acknowledge I'm experiencing anxiety. I can tolerate it, and it's worth it to tolerate. Yes, it's unpleasant and unfortunate, but it's not the end of the world. It's not going to kill me. So there's lots of ways that we can look at that emotion and start to appraise it and evaluate it and judge it in a more functional way for our performance, instead of demonizing it and then trying to suppress it because we're just desperate not to experience it.
Yeah. Yeah, and I think a lot of the anxiety we experience as people and also in the performance settings, it stems from an idea that we should be a certain way, that somewhere across our life we have invented a vision of how we should be like, even though it may not have any ground. And I suppose it usually doesn't. And when we are not that way, then we begin to get anxious. We're not fitting this picture of how how we have visioned ourselves to be in a certain scenario, or there is a threat that our goal is being taken away from us by our emotions or something else. But yes, when we think about reframing our experience of our emotions or other things, I suppose it can be seen somewhat as a pattern that we need to learn. Because again, when I'm thinking about patterns that people internalize, it's a subject that is quite intriguing for me. And especially now, if we're talking about our thought patterns and emotional patterns, it's something that people are repeating and through them kind of creating their own world, their own reality they are living. And of course, behind every pattern exists a choice, and that we are choosing to be and act a certain way. However, to a great extent, I suppose the majority of those choices are unconscious, that we are kind of on this autopilot mode. But referring to patterns, as you have worked and are working in several industries, with the athletes, in the military, in the academy, with executives and so forward, would you say that there is something in common that people would generally struggle with under pressure?
Yeah, to me, from what I've seen, it's the fusing of your identity with your endeavor,
Mm-hmm.
with your vocation or whatever you choose to do with your life, that you fuse your identity so that this isn't just a presentation. It's my whole being is on the line. And if I fail here, then I'm a failure. And if I fail, then I'll lose my job, I'll lose everything. And, what would I be? I would be nothing if I failed.
Mm.
That to me is one of the more dangerous patterns of thinking that we would see. Yes, we've got things like, this is really important for me, and maybe it's not going to go my way, and here's some of the negative consequences. That is all going to feed that anxiety. But all of that could be true. So
Mm.
yes, it is important. Yes, there are indications here that it might not go your way. Yes, there are consequences to you not performing well, and obviously consequences to you performing well. All of that's true. But when somebody fuses their identity with that, then you start to work in a land of untruth. It is not true that all you are is an athlete or a business person, a teacher, a parent. These are roles that you play. They're parts of you. Once it becomes everything that you are, then all of those key performances, key decisions, presentations, whatever it is, there's a weight to them that brings that pressure because you're bringing everything that you are to that thing. Now, like with everything, there's positives and negatives to this. The positive is that you're very motivated because you don't even question putting in hard work to do that thing because it's who you are. The downside is what happens when things don't go well, which they won't, because you're a human being and you're working in an environment where it's uncontrollable and unpredictable and dangerous. So at some point you will face adversity. Now you're
Yeah.
going to react more strongly to that adversity if your entire being is on the line every time you face difficulty. So that would be something that I think is a really major kind of pattern that I see with people that's developed over time. The more they sacrifice time and effort to that pursuit, the more their identity becomes fused. And we know these beliefs that we would call global evaluation or depreciation within REBT, we know that those can be particularly dangerous from a well-being perspective, more so than a performance perspective, I would say.
Yes. So starting to think that what you are doing is 100% of who you are. And
Yeah. So if
so,
I fail, I'm a complete failure.
yeah.
That's the problem. That's when that logic starts to kick in, and that's when it becomes really problematic, I think.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes, and the other question you already answered, but I was thinking that if we take this certain belief that if I fail, I am a complete failure, that is it a belief that can fuel both personal development, but also personal destruction in terms of thinking destruction to be personal suffering, because that is what we are really creating for ourselves down the line. So yes, I suppose like you said, it will be very fueling for our motivation to perform the very, very best we can in every moment. But perhaps also then creating more anxiety linked to that performance in the moment, which can be kind of downgrading for it at the end also. So if there's a lot of energy going inside that inner battle, that we are then pushing ourselves to maintain.
Comes down to, in some ways, it comes down to the deployment of resources. So you're going into an important situation and you have a finite amount of resource to deploy. Let's call that a psychological resource, your mental effort and mental energy. You've got some decisions to make. Now, if your decision is to spend all of that energy trying to control your emotion, then that's going to exhaust you and you'll probably fail. So it's almost like not pushing against that and trying to accept what happens from an emotional perspective and accept that these are just feelings and they're not necessarily representative of reality. You might have visions of complete failure and embarrassment. Those are just visions. It's not actually happening. There's that aspect to that and not working against those emotions. But really, from an RBT perspective, our solution would be more around practicing patterns of thinking that when you get into those situations, you express those emotions as functional and positive. Not positive in terms of how they feel, because anxiety can still feel unpleasant, even if it's helpful for our performance, but positive in terms of its outlook for my performance and particularly my well-being. So there's things you can do in the moment to not work against the emotion as a way to manage the emotion better. But over time, this is about not practicing the pattern of thinking that says, this is everything and this is all I am. And it's resisting the temptation to do that. And then when you go into performance situations, you don't have that heavy, that gravity, you can see the situation for what it is in reality, rather than everything's on the line.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes, and I think one way to kind of help oneself in those situations is to practice this rational and constructive self-talk, and maybe make it a daily pattern or daily choice that you are repeating the idea that you are not your performance, you are not your work, you really are just human being in that sense. Because sometimes if we try to start to control our thinking, at least for myself, because I'm an overthinker, so if I try to start controlling that side and kind of push it down or change it, it's just going to get louder. But then I have learned, and I also think that as a coach, I have found it to be useful to other people. Practicing the rational self-talk can over time start to direct this automatic thinking
Yeah.
of how we see ourselves in the world and in our performance.
Well, you've got lots of options when it comes to regulating emotion. Let's take anxiety, for example. So we've spoken about suppression. We've spoken about catharsis,
Mm,
but you could avoid, which is a very popular way to avoid, a way to not experience anxiety. Now, you can avoid the situation that gives rise to anxiety.
mm,
Okay. So what does that look like in a performance context? Well, it looks like me never putting myself forward for things, me never
mm,
really competing as much as I could compete through the fear of that pressure, of having to face that pressure. Now,
mm,
over time, that's not going to help you in your performance. It means that you'll hide, and
mm,
people who hide tend not to be noticed and tend not to be in those situations that really matter and count.
mm,
So avoidance is very tempting. Now, what we're saying in broad-based CBT, cognitive behavioral approaches, particularly within sport, is what we're saying. Actually, the opposite works better. Lean into those pressure situations,
mm,
expose yourself to tough situations, and put your hand up for things to volunteer to do, as a way to learn to regulate emotion. And we can structure around that ways of thinking that help you to deal with that emotion. So it's a mix between this kind of rational way of thinking, way of
mm,
believing, this use of logic and pragmatics and evidence-based thinking. It's a mix of that and exposure. You've got to expose yourself to these tricky situations and learn how to regulate emotion in the moment. It can't just be done in theory.
mm.
And that goes against people's want to avoid. We're saying,
Yeah.
no, do the opposite. And that can be really tough for people.
Yeah, I can imagine, like, usually when we are in an uncomfortable situation, we really have three options. And one is to accept the situation for what it is. The other one is to change it. And the third one is to leave. And
Mm.
I imagine that leaving is like a very nice and quick way to remove that aspect from your life or that day.
Yeah.
Yes, but continuing with patterns and leaning on the subject of mixing our self-worth with the performance and our work, there's this pattern of performance outcome addiction, which I feel can be a very like timely and present subject in high performance environments, that instead of having a strong preference for the performance outcome, we start to get addicted to it. So what would you say would be the main difference between those two? So having a strong preference versus having an addiction for performance outcome.
Well, that addiction to the outcome starts to manifest in um, your emotions, your thoughts, your behaviors being essentially contingent upon and dictated by the outcome.
Mm,
So, for example, you might say you go into a performance, say you go into a 90-minute match and you do everything right. as much as it's possible to do everything right in a sporting event. Your movement's good, you stick to the game plan, but we lose the game. Okay. Now I'd forget all of those good things because we lost. I forget the positive things that I did, the gains that I made, things I learned, the ways I helped the team, because we lost. Because I'm so addicted to the outcome, and that's all that matters. It completely dictates the processes that take shape after the game. So I can't reflect in a balanced way. I can only see the loss. The second way it sort of manifests is through demands. So, of course, I want to win, but it's not that just I want to, it's that I have to, that I must always win. And when I don't win, then it's the end of the world and it's terrible and I'm useless, I'm an idiot. And I really sort of beat myself up afterwards, So this is something that is very common in sport because, like many industries, it's a results-driven industry. The further you go up the ladder in terms of eliteness, it can get worse because not only are your performances, not only are you in a results-driven industry, which is often zero-sum, win or lose. You obviously got a draw there, but you've also got public scrutiny and the public nature of your performance. So that adds to this because the consequences of loss are even more severe. Is public scrutiny, which human beings fear more than anything, to be isolated from an in-group. And social media makes that worse for performers these days, exponentially worse as social media grows and access to performance is greater than ever. So, it does start to feed that addiction to results. It's all about the outcome. Now, as a sports psychologist, we of course recognize that the outcome is important because if this system doesn't perform as well as it could, then we're all out of a job. That's the reality of working in some performance domains. But the obsession with results and the addiction to results can blind us from real growth and development, and it can dictate and determine our reactions to performance such that we forget all the good stuff and we can't really focus and have a balanced perspective on what actually took place because our minds are just obsessed with the result.
Yeah. And when I think about how a performer would kind of end up in this situation of having a very addictive relationship with the performance outcome, I think it's kind of the same as would be with really developing any addiction, is that first there's this loss of connectedness with the self, that you kind of start to replace your self-worth slowly with the performance outcome or who you are as a player or as a coach, like we talked about earlier. But then also to fuel that, there's the loop of external validation, which can be both healthy and it can also be unhealthy. And when I'm thinking about a healthy dynamic of external validation, whether it be in the working place or with friends, it's kind of a very constructive dynamic. It's supportive, it's informative, it sees the whole picture, and it is kind of a base to helping you develop as a person towards your potential. But when the external validation becomes unhealthy, it's more like bias and one-sided, that you have to be a certain way. In this case, it could be that you have to perform a certain way, or that external validation will go away in that sense, kind of creating more nature of dependency based on a single aspect, not so much for the development of the individual to reach their full potential, because it comes more in this nature of feeding the addiction to whatever that external validation is linked to. So those are some of my thoughts of healthy external validation and then unhealthy external validation. But you probably have more in your mind.
Well, I think you kind of said it there around contingent self-worth
Mm,
is where it can get tricky for people. So what do you base your perception of self-worth upon?
mm,
If it's external validation, then your self-worth is dependent upon factors you cannot control. So
mm,
therefore it's dangerous. Versus I have a core sense of self-worth, and my self-worth comes from a place of mere existence. Like, I am worthwhile because I exist. Okay, so
mm,
that would be probably the softer REBT position.
mm,
You are worth something because you exist.
mm,
The second harder position for REBT would be to speak of worth and value in human beings is a non-starter. We there's no value to us. We just exist. We're here. We don't
mm,
need to have a value or have a worth. We just are. Now, both of those positions get you to the same place, that your worth cannot be contingent upon how you perform, what people think about you, what people are willing to pay you and give you. That has nothing to do with your self-worth. If somebody's salary is £500,000 and somebody's salary is, £20,000, those two people are either worth the same because they both exist, or they're both worth nothing. They're
mm.
just there. One isn't worth more than the other. And this is a Stoic position, a big S Stoic, not a small s Stoic. When I say Stoic, I mean the school of philosophy. This is a Stoic position, and it's one that's captured in REBT. And I think that helps you to not be so swayed emotionally, and in terms of how you think and believe, not be so swayed by the outcome, by
Yeah.
external validation. Now, of course, you want to look at something and say, okay, well, we failed. So what are we going to do to make sure that doesn't happen again?
Mm,
You're not just, you're not ignorant of success and failure, but at the same time, you're not letting that failure or that success define your worth and define who you are and your value, because then
mm,
that's dangerous. Because as we said, you cannot always control the result. You could play amazing and still lose,
mm,
or you could be in a team where maybe you're the best player on the team objectively. Maybe you're the best player, less errors, however you want to define that within that team, and still lose. So it's too complicated to base your self-worth on anything that happens in a performance environment.
yes. And the aspect you just said about the values of human beings, or in other words, that human beings are valueless, that we are existing and we all have the same value. But I think one misconception, if we're talking about Stoicism or RABT or RSCF, that if we're saying that, well, human beings are valueless, then people can think like, oh, you don't value like humanity and so forward. But it's really, I think, more about that if we give a value to a human being, we are simultaneously implying that there could be a value rating system of
Yeah, yeah,
human beings. And I actually am a bit concerned about human beings these days for more than one reason. But one of the reasons is definitely that it seems to be a somewhat of a common idea that human beings have a value rating system, that
yeah,
it can be developed by the individual themselves. For instance, with this performance outcome addiction, that, okay, because I am the best player of the year in this team, then my value is greater than the value of like my teammates. But also, I'm generally just looking at other people and creating these images in one's mind, like how I should feel like, because I want my value as a human to be high. And
yeah,
if I do not reach that, then that's again the loss of connectedness with the self, the evolvement of anxiety, and probably depression also in this instance. So that in itself is a big subject. Also, the
Mm.
value or non-value of
I think I
feelings.
land on the position of non-value because it's
Mm,
the ultimate equality.
yeah.
None of us are worth anything, but that's just
Yes.
that seems fine to me. Let's operate from that perspective, and that doesn't mean we can't try to perform well and be good people and do the right thing. It doesn't
Mm,
mean we have to abandon our value systems, the ones that work anyway. But also it kind of allows you to completely take that thinking out of the conversation
mm,
in a really useful way. I think to never assume that when you do something good that increases your value.
mm,
It just means you did something good,
mm.
you know.
Yeah.
So I think that however you want to arrive at that point, making sure your self-worth, your the value you ascribe to yourself is not contingent upon external events is really important,
Yes.
and internal events. Like, if you are thinking negatively today, that doesn't decrease or diminish your value, you know.
Mm,
But I think the second thing for me of why that's potentially important is because you will face problems and adversities in your life. It's just not possible to get through life without facing some adversity, probably lots of adversity. And there is this, and I would say again, social media is partly responsible for this. There is this signaling from people on social media that you should be living a perfect life. Look how perfect my life is. Well, you should be living the same. Why aren't you living the same life? What are you doing wrong? And then we make value judgments. Well, they're worth more than me because they're living the dream or they're living a certain life and I'm not. Okay, now my motivation is to drive towards these external indicators of worth, to
mm,
have that car, to travel to that place, to live that kind of life in lots of domains, whether it's relationships or whether it's work, whether it's hobbies and interests. So it creates that competitiveness because I'm deferring to external validation. I'm deferring to that when it comes to my self-worth,
mm.
you know? And I think that's where it starts to get, with the proliferation of social media, it starts to get tricky for people, that competitive side when it comes to worth. Yeah.
Yes, social media, it was fun when it started, and now it's made everybody addicted to it, and people are trying to find their way out of it and how to kind of rehabilitate oneself of not
Yeah.
using it so much, because I think people are noticing the amount of anxiety that it is causing in terms of this competitiveness, which is based on somewhat avatar image that of oneself that people are feeding in there that is not real, which is a bit insane when you think about it, that you start to compete with something that is really not real. It's like a tiny proportion of a situation that one person has decided to show you.
Yeah. And even that human capacity to project what experience somebody's having, even away from social media.
Mm,
You might have a role model. Maybe the role model is in your team. You say, that's who I want to be. That's a good person to follow. You're projecting who they are. You're creating an idealized version of them, and
mm,
you're aspiring to be that or be close to that.
mm,
There's nothing necessarily wrong with that, of creating an ideal and chasing the
yeah.
ideal. But when you start to attach your self-worth to that in a way that's like, distance from that ideal will dictate my self-worth. So
Mm,
I'm far away from that ideal, which means my self-worth is super low. So I'm quite close to that ideal, so my self-worth is pumped up quite a bit. That's when, that doesn't really help us. Of course, it's good of course, comparison can be good. It can be a motivator, and it can help me to strive to work harder. And that's part of the reason why role models are really important in performance environments. But it should never be a question of worth and
Yeah.
self-worth or other worth. And that's tricky because the performance environment does give value to people in monetary terms. It gives value to people in time. So let's take an example again of a football team. Say we play on the same football team and I play for 70 minutes and you come on as a substitute and you play 20 minutes. The perception is I'm worth more than you because I get more minutes. Let's say I'm also paid more than you. So my value is higher in monetary terms. These are all external. This is all external validation. Now, it's fine to have that and to just see it for what it is. Yes, I play for more minutes. Yes, I'm earning more than you. But that doesn't say anything about our value as human beings.
Yeah.
You know? And the danger is when I start to assume that it says something about my value as a human being, that it starts to get a bit darker.
Yeah, and I can't imagine that it will make you feel very content in the long term with yourself, with your life, because then if you will probably get addicted to this so-called value rating system that you all the time need something more in order to ensure that your value is still high. And if you do not receive it anymore, there will be somewhat of a collapse in the identity and the self-worth aspect. And then moving to reframe that there is this phrase I really like. It's from a book on actually it's Indian religious thoughts. The phrase goes so that we are always entitled to our work and never the outcome. And basically what that says to me, or what ideas that kind of stems, is that if we think, for instance, about a performer, an athlete who has really poured their soul into their performance and they have this one goal of being chosen to compete an important match, and their points just simply aren't enough and they do not gain that goal. Or in other terms, that you have a business leader who has poured their soul into the business and then something external happens, which is very timely. We're experiencing a lot of adversities in the world and the business collapses and they go bankrupt. In both of these cases, like, I don't think the worth of the work should be diminished by the outcome, because the outcome is always dictated by these external factors. So when I go back to that phrase, we are entitled to our work and never the outcome, it kind of feels comforting in the sense that one can maybe reframe their awareness and attention to the work itself and less to that of what the outcome is, especially when it usually is a point of this external validation and dependent on the choices of other people.
Yeah, I mean, one of the reasons you would focus on the processes of the performance rather than the outcome is because you can get some consistency in those processes. And of course, if you do the right things, you're more likely to get the right result. But what can you repeat? What are you able to get consistency with? What are you able to do time after time after time? It's going to be that work, those processes. Are you able to win every time? In most domains, no. You can't guarantee success, which makes it that's why it's not logical to demand success. But it is possible to make those processes very consistent, and that's going to be different to every performer in different sports, at different levels, different age groups. It's going to be different, but it's still a focus on those processes rather than the outcome.
Yeah.
In sport, in performance settings, you don't need to mention the outcome. It's you can assume that people in the room want to win. There's, I've been in teams where they talk about winning as if nobody wants to win. Like, most important thing is we get the win. Well, we know that's what we're all here to do.
Mm.
It's the how that's the problem. It's the how that's the difficult thing. It's not the motivation and desire. You sometimes see this in sporting competition. Oh, team A just wanted it more than team B, as if that was the deciding factor. It's the team A maybe handled their processes better and paid more attention to them and were more detailed and were focused on execution on the day more than team B. So it's very tempting in sport to focus on that outcome because it dictates so many things, has so many consequences, good and bad, but it's really a red herring. It's not the thing you should be focusing on. It's the processes that then lead to that result, possibly, potentially, that should be the focus of your effort and attention.
Yes. And I suppose one appeal on focusing on the outcome of the performance, whether it be in sports or something else, getting a raise, for instance, is that we have an expectancy to be happy once we get that outcome, that the outcome in itself will make us a happy person. But this is also interesting because we are relying to be happy based on, once again, and something external. But it also, when I think about it, it's also something that I feel that people are being programmed to do by the system that surrounds us, that we are kind of programmed for productivity in order to try to reach the certain outcomes that we expect will be making us happy on the long run. But I assume that well, since you are working with kind of high achievers in the performance settings and so forward, is this something that comes across to you, that people are chasing a certain outcome because they're expecting to be happy once they receive it for like their future?
I think I see that probably less in sport and more
Mm,
in business.
mm,
So, it, you know, there's this assumption that you can kind of like plan for happiness. Like if this happens, then I'd be happy. But actually, when you speak to people who have, achieved the thing they wanted to, the thing they dreamt of, it's not necessarily happiness that they report.
mm,
Because you can't. Happiness is something that happens almost unexpectedly. Something lands on your desk that's amazing and it makes you happy, or somebody achieves something who you have a connection with that can
mm,
lead to happiness. It's hard to plan happiness, especially in achievement contexts, because high achievers often share this kind of trait of having achieved something, thinking, well, what's next? How do I repeat it?
mm.
And what does this mean for me for my next steps? Where now?
Yeah.
Now that is anxiety. That's not happiness. That's a worry. That's a concern about what's next. And that's moving again into the unknown. So we're moving from, from kind of a potentially, or what should be in that person's mind, a very positive situation that they should be really happy and all the rest of it, moving very quickly from that euphoric experience to, oh, okay, well, that worked out. I'm quite relieved. Now what's next? But as you mentioned there, the systems that we operate within, they sell us happiness.
Mm,
They do sell us those happy faces when it comes to purchasing decisions, when it comes to organizing your life. Your life should be organized around these happy experiences. And if you're not doing the right things, you won't experience those happy things. So what are the right things? Being productive, buying things,
mm,
looking a certain way, projecting yourself outwardly in a certain way on social media, for example. That's the stuff that leads to happiness. That's what the system often tells us. Now, read any ancient philosophy and they'll warn you against this. But
mhm,
it seems that we've fallen into that way of being. Most psychologists would not agree with that trajectory either. So it's curious how it's happened, but it seems to me that governments, systems benefit from our productivity, benefit
Yes.
from us chasing happiness and chasing those experiences and those material things, because we'll work harder and generate, as well as generating tax, which is obviously very easy to calculate, just generating product, our
Mm-hmm.
labor being worth something, So it's sneaky, but it's in marketing, it's in media, it's in government, it's everywhere, it's in social media. And living a life that goes away from that can be tricky.
Yeah. I don't know because I'm living a life that goes away from that. So I'm probably not the best person to comment on that, but it has been a choice for as long as I do remember, that all my choices were based on kind of a freedom to be away from that. Like it's just how my brain has worked since a child. I'm not going to go too far into that personal uh, choice. But in any case, this is a very interesting subject for me because I'm looking at this phenomenon a bit from the outside, like that, okay, this is how people are operating in these societies. And I would say it does link greatly to what we talked about earlier on external validation, that like in some way at some time it got kind of really integrated into the system, and then people started to internalize that idea that, by achieving these things, again linking to the value rating system of humans, which does not exist. But if we look at the programming around us, it could imply that it does exist, and it's based on your productivity, on how much you purchase, on how much you earn, and so forward. So it got integrated into the belief system of people. But what makes it very interesting is that I think pretty much all do recognize that, as you said, that when we achieve something external, then we have this ecstatic emotion, but it will go away in like 3 seconds, or maybe not that fast, but in any way, it's quite fast. And then we're like, okay. And there's almost this kind of emptiness that, well, what am I supposed to do now that I achieved my goal? And
Yeah.
yes. So you said that, like, in terms of more the business setting than the sports setting, that business executives, leaders can think in a way that certain success of their business perhaps would feed their sense of happiness and achievement. Yet it does not exactly report itself that way. So how does it report itself then?
In the business setting,
Mm,
well, often what you'll get is like this deep sense of regret when you have people in their mid to late careers of the sacrifices they've made towards something, a vocation that has rewarded that person financially. They might have accolades, they'll have material things, but often what they won't have is closeness with family. They might not have been able to maintain successful relationships. They might not have any interests or pursuits outside of that working domain. So again, it comes back to what we spoke about earlier, is the fusing of their identity with their pursuit, their endeavor, their vocation. So it will manifest often, in a regret that they have when they reach that point in their careers and they look back and say, was it really worth it? I have some houses, some nice cars, lots of material possessions, but I don't really have the thing that would sustain me in this part of my life. Some executives I work with just see their entire lives as a waste of time up to that point, regardless of how successful they are, because what they really yearn for is connection with somebody, or a deeper sense of purpose, And there's no going back. You can't reverse time. That time's gone. So it's like, where'd you go with those people? So to me, it kind of catches up with people in the end. And it's very, very hard to teach people when they're on the up, when, say, they're in their 20s and they're like, really, really driven towards those external things because they've got all this motivation and it's working for them. They're getting accolades, they're earning money, they're getting these nice things, And then for many of them, it just hits them one day that they've lived quite a superficial life. This isn't to really down talk the pursuit of success and wealth, because there's lots of reasons why we do that as human beings. Part of your job on this earth is to create resource and to create a legacy with that resource. That is quite an evolutionary way to look at this. But there's also a sense that the more you do that, the more you kind of move away from that kind of human authenticity of again, what you should be doing. There's that sense of how I should be living. And the more that you chase the external stuff, the more you move away from the things that really sustain you and really help you to be content. And that's hard for people to hear because they probably think they probably think it's not true, and that it's just some psychologist trying to convince them to scale back their goals or do something that's woolly and soft. But this is pretty common. Read any autobiography by any highly successful person and look at them reflecting on their life. You will see the same patterns emerge. And this is something we've known since some of the ancient philosophies.
Yeah.
So this isn't new. This isn't necessarily controversial even. It's not a popular opinion in circles that really value external reward and success in that way. It's unpopular to those people. And those are really our audience. So it's tricky. Those are the people we want to help and people we want to work with, isn't it? But they don't want to hear it sometimes. Yeah.
Yes. However, it is an important subject to be talked about because it is very, very timely. I feel that this age of high productivity and like building all of this technology and products and services and stuff, basically, just to kind of compactly put it into one word, stuff is coming to an end, when I don't think we can do it any more than we have done it to this point. Everything is going faster and faster. And I think there are a lot of people kind of starting to turn to the idea, at least when I'm having conversations, that wait, like, what's the point of this? Like when we are looking at our environment, we have a lot of things, a lot of stuff that we don't really need. We have a lot of jobs, a lot of incredibly complicated titles that we don't really need also. And kind of people climbing up that ladder for even more complicated titles that we still don't need. So there must be a sense of some kind of a hollowness there that the people will also recognize in themselves, that they kind of do know, but they don't want to look at it directly. However, when I'm thinking about this, like the risk of what you just said, the problems emerging later on in life, that we would feel regret and even see our life as a waste of time doing the things we have done or the choices we have made, turning into superficiality. I think the beginning of that problem, but also a lot of the problems we are seeing in the world, is the loss of connectedness with the self. Like I also said in terms of the addiction, that as we lose connectedness of the self, of the human being we are losing connectedness with the world around us, with nature, with other people, and kind of really deep, authentic relationships that again we start to replace with this external validation and a deep desire for that connectedness and being seen by other people, but we are looking for it in kind of the wrong place. I think there was still one big subject I wanted to talk about in this podcast, and that was exploring the difference between a strong mindset and a rigid mindset. Sometimes when we look at mental toughness, we can think that, okay, that is like a strong human being who has good well-being and will go very far. But also this kind of mental toughness, developing an extreme sense of rigidness, is something that can turn against us if we are looking at our lives in a very small lens, kind of dictated by I must be something, or I must do this, or I must be a certain way. So what would you say are the differences between a strong mindset and a rigid mindset?
Well, a strong mindset to me is something that is difficult to shake, regardless
Mm.
of the adversity that you face and the potential failure and success that you face. You know, so that's something that is, call it resilient to external factors. That to me would be strong. Now, you want to make sure that that strong mindset is oriented in the right direction. What you don't
Mm.
want is a strong mindset that is oriented in the wrong direction and that will lead you to repeated failure and lead you to not learning the things that you could learn. A rigid mindset to me is one that's inflexible, completely inflexible, geared towards one way of experiencing the world. You know, so I must not experience anxiety. I must not be anxious when things get tough. I must succeed. I must be perfect. I must always win things. This is setting up one experience of performance or one experience of life that is very difficult to sustain and maintain. You know, so yes, you can have a strong rigid mindset, but the problem with that strong rigid mindset isn't the strength; it's the rigidity. It's the fact that you've basically taken what is very complicated and you simplified it to the point where it's unworkable into a demand for success, or into a again, simplifying the self into being about one thing, one rigid thing. I am an athlete. That's everything that I am. It's too rigid. So it's not the strength, it's the rigidity that's the problem there. You of course want to develop strong beliefs, strong ways of seeing yourself and the world that are based on evidence and that can maintain over time. You don't want to, every time you go into a new situation, have to use a new thought or belief. You want to develop things that you can carry with you that are useful in lots of situations. For example, I might want to do well, but there's nothing to say that I have to. Well, that's going to help you in your next presentation. It's going to help you in your next interaction with somebody, your next performance. That's going to be true across any situation. So that could be something you could strengthen and really work on and really, ingrain into yourself. So yeah, there's differences there. Strength to me it can be a good thing, but rigidity, I don't think it is.
Yeah.
I can't, I think being inflexible is a
Yeah.
difficult sell for me. That's going to be useful in most performance settings.
Yes. Yes, and you said it there that for me also the difference between strength and rigidity or mental toughness when it kind of goes the wrong way is definitely adaptability, because we need to keep our capability to adapt in different circumstances as human beings when we're going about our lives, because basically so much of the encounters we are facing day to day are something that we cannot plan for. I mean, that's what makes life beautiful also. But if you're holding on to this rigid mindset, it kind of comes across your path in a sense that it will keep you from developing, adapting to the circumstances, which again is a factor that leads people and helps them to obtain their full potential, is adapting to the situations as they come. But then on the same note, it's interesting for me to see that sometimes we forget, or people kind of seem to forget, that we have a choice in every situation we are in. Also, that we do not have this obligation to live our life, or choose our work or upkeep our business if it does not serve our development anymore as human beings. Quite often I notice that because people have chosen something like 5 years ago or 10 years ago, they kind of go into this programming mode that this is how I have to be now. Like, okay, I took this loan, so I do not have a choice of changing my life. I will just live here and do the same things for the next 10 years, for the next 20 years, to make that choice work for me in the future, which is incredibly intriguing also, because we never know what our future self is going to be like. So behind adaptability, like kind of returning to that subject, and behind the strong mindset is the sense of choice as responsibility also, that we are responsible to make choices in our life that work for us, and be brave in that sense, not lean on something we have said or done 10 years ago and be like, okay, well, that's it. Yes. So that was just some thoughts that came to my mind when I thought about what is a strong mindset versus what is a rigid mindset, because a rigid mindset could lean more on that because we have chosen something to be a certain way forever, that is how our life path will be ingrained.
Yeah, I think people put themselves into a bit of a cul-de-sac with their
Mm,
choices. And because they've invested time and effort and resource into that direction, then
mm,
they're resistant to come away from it and to change direction and make different choices. It's really hard for people. I mean, I've worked with lots of people that are deeply unhappy in their jobs. And th- th- that's quite a choice to come away from something that you're trained in, you've dedicated, say, 15, 20 years to then transition from that to something different. It often takes a huge life event for people to do that. Look at COVID, for example. We saw an increase in career transitions through COVID.
mm,
We saw lots of job change, not only because people were being made redundant from their jobs, for example, but also people reevaluated their priorities and their values
mhm,
during a time of, world sort of tragedy. There's a reevaluation, and it encouraged people to make those difficult choices. It kind of freed them up a little bit, just mentally,
yeah,
to say, actually, I'm not living the way I want to be living, and I could be doing something different. For them to just, you know, to just do that suddenly, that's tricky for them to do, and they're often pushed to make those choices because of external events. But one of the reasons they are sitting in front of me is because they've come to the end of some sort of road. They're suffering in some way, and they want to make some changes. Sometimes those changes are psychological changes, ways of
mm,
thinking differently and emoting differently. But just because we're psychologists does not mean to say we only explore the mental side of this. It might also
mm,
be the person actually wants to and should, in a sense of, um, it, is the best solution. Actually, the best solution might be for them to change their circumstances, the
yeah,
environment they the environment they're in from a work perspective or a living perspective or relationship perspective, and then your job is to help them through that transition. So it's those cul-de-sacs are really difficult to get out of, especially when you've invested time, resource, money. It's like, okay, well, I'm not. I've detached from the self here. I'm not living the way I should be
mm,
living. If that should is the perception of me, the perception of myself. I'm nowhere near who I really am when I'm working in this way, when I'm doing
mm,
this thing. How do I get back to that? Or how do I reach that? And that's tough for people. Yeah, it's a really tricky
yeah.
one.
Yeah, and it is kind of the last question to explore to end this on a positive note, because the subjects have been a bit heavy. To explore a little bit how to build like your life, your performance, career, but essentially they are around the same thing. It is your day-to-day being here as a human being, how to develop and build that more as a process of self-alignment versus self-erasure. And I can start with one point. I was thinking that probably it's difficult for people to like jump to a completely different life, but perhaps like small changes, if you are recognizing these like loops of external validation and so forward, what we have been talking about in this podcast is to kind of be brave to perhaps even start changing your social setting. And I'm not saying to get rid of all your relationships and like something like this, but more so to have more people around you that would bring in different perspectives of how your performance or your business would play out in terms of your self-worth. Because I can imagine one thing that makes it very difficult for people to leave um, the things or work that does not serve them anymore is because of the social setting they have built around it. Also because that kind of brings more emotional life and personal life into that okay, but if I end this, then who am I going to be, not only for myself but for other people also?
Yeah, I could definitely see that. But also, what you see is people that were taken by a wave of misdirection, or at least no direction. So, for example, somebody leaves school, maybe they go to college, maybe they don't, but they just didn't know what to do. So they found a job, and they just did that job, and they've just been doing that job for 15, 20, 30 years, you know? Now, they haven't kind of passionately pursued something and got to the end of that passion, and now they're looking to transition. And this is why I sometimes talk about the differences between people that I would work with in the business setting and people in sport. My experience of most people in sport, athletes, coaches, is that they weren't just swept by a wave of not knowing what to do. They passionately and deliberately pursued this thing. You know, they sacrificed, they put in the extra work, they watched sport constantly, read about it, they became real experts in that area, and they pursued it. And then they get to the end of their careers. Athletes have very short careers depending on the sport, and then they have to transition into something. Okay. But what I'm seeing often in the business side isn't that they've pursued something passionately. It's that they had to get a job at some point. They seem to think this job might have been good, so they just did it for 20, 30 years. But all the time they were doing that job, their passion was somewhere else, and it was in something else. But one example I can use is when I used to teach on a master's program, sport and exercise psychology master's, distance learning, and was in the fortunate position to run that program for a couple of years. Now, the students we would get wouldn't be students coming from an undergraduate degree straight into a master's. We had some of those, but the majority of people were people interested in career transition, people who had done a job for many years and were now interested in becoming sport and exercise psychologists. They wanted to retrain and restudy. Now they're pursuing their passion. And that's a difficult transition. But the deep sense of you are now pursuing something that is closer to who you are, or your idea of who you are and who you want to be. You're getting closer to the self when you're doing that. Now, along the way, you'll find challenges mixing study and work, which I did, you know, for many years. It's tricky, difficult to do, and there's moments where you just want to quit. But the people that continue and persist, might end up in a position where they transition their careers to something that aligns with who they are more significantly or strongly. So in taking that risk, they end up in a really great position. And maybe many of them had to take a bit of a pay cut and a bit of a change in their stability to do that. But they're more content as human beings because they're now on a path that feels more authentic. When I say authentic, something that is closer to their idea of themselves, because they were swept by this wave in their early lives of, well, I have to do something, and this is something, so I'll just do that. It's better than doing nothing, but it wasn't their passion. So working with those people, you start to kind of understand how different that is to kind of working with athletes who really did have that passion. They pursued it, and then they have to transition at some point, but they're coming from different perspectives when they're transitioning. And that's the interesting thing. The athlete is moving away from their idealized self. Whereas the person I'm talking about who transitions, say, their career to be a sports psychologist, for example, is transitioning towards their idealized self. Two very different perspectives.
Could an athlete in these instances build a new idealized version of themselves? Could you see like that happening? Because as you said, they have put so much of their soul and time in the version they are as an athlete, and it is a like conscious goal they have pursued after, and this is like who they truly want to be, and they have reached that idealized version of themselves, but for some reason they need to transition away from it. So do you see that they can create a new version of the idealized version of themselves, or is it something that kind of just then remains in the background?
I think they can, but I think they have to plan for it.
Yeah.
They have to plan for it. They have to make a good life plan, and that's not encouraged necessarily in athletes. Why would a performance system encourage you to think about life after you're outside of the system? It wouldn't make sense for the system. They should be doing that from an ethical perspective, but many of them don't. Some do, some are great. I'm not tarring sport with this brush completely, but so you have to plan. You have to understand that what are you going to move on to? And many athletes run businesses alongside their careers and are very well, nicely set up. But all too many athletes have an identity crisis and turn to alcoholism. They turn to gambling addiction. They end up with all kinds of mental health issues, partly because of that identity crisis, that kind of identity foreclosure. All of a sudden your identity stops. It's foreclosed. You go from every single day being on a treadmill, like literally sometimes, but figuratively, you're on this process. You're told where to be and what time to be there, and you're moving along, and you're part of a system that is. I wouldn't say it's comfortable, but it can be comforting to know that you're part of something, and you have purpose, and you have, again, value. You're contributing something to the world, and then to go from that to the next day not doing that, that's a very strange experience. It can be very jarring unless you've made plans, you're anticipating that. For example, in many careers, you have the opportunity to do this slowly. So, okay, I'm going to drop down to 3 days a week. And then in 5 years, I'm going to drop down to just do 1 day, just do a little bit here on the side. Maybe you become a consultant and you drop into organizations and help them. We don't really have that in sport. Like, you wouldn't have an athlete who suddenly drops down to 1 training session a week, So you have this sudden stop quite often. Now, that can be something you've dictated and said, I want to stop playing. My body can't do it anymore, or there's other issues that you want to stop for. Maybe you've achieved everything you think you can, and you think, okay, it's a good place to stop. But sometimes it's not up to you, and you get a career-ending injury, and that's very jarring and very sudden. And the identity crisis can happen very quickly. So, if you're able to plan and able to do that, then I think it's going to be smoother. Still difficult, but if you've got some plans, you got some ideas of your exit plans, then I think it's going to be better. But yeah.
Yeah, and I suppose what makes it tougher for athletes also is that they start off so young in comparison to
Mm,
perhaps other fields and executives, that it's quite often something that they have been involved with since they have been a child, like
that's right.
playing certain
Yeah.
sports, and through childhood they have started to build slowly that identity, and then it carries on through the youth. But also, if there comes a sudden stop, then I suppose, for instance, through injury, it would come more often to athletes also at a relatively young age than would be the case with other professions. So also
Mm.
the lack of life experience can make the transition much more difficult to do than, for instance, if you would be doing it at an older age. And again, I could understand that there is the kind of urge to get that same feeling, that same rush from something else fast, because you've learned to live in the environment that is exciting and like quite fast paced. And when it's not there anymore, life, I suppose, can feel a bit boring. So in that sense,
Well,
then
exciting, fast paced, unpredictable. There is an environment that replicates that, and it's called gambling.
yes, that was
And
what I
that's,
was coming to
yeah,
slowly, that seeking for the rush somewhere else would seem to naturally connect with what you said with gambling or
mm,
partying, or
yeah, yeah,
then getting involved with other substances.
yeah.
And we kind of landed on
I
the
thought you said
negative
you were
side.
ending on a positive. I thought you were trying to end on a positive. Oh,
I was really truly
we
trying,
are just typical, yeah,
but
typical
we're just like
psychology.
kind of tipping towards the negative.
Well, I think your
But
question was, can people redefine? Of course they can.
my original
They can,
question was that, can people redefine their identity coming from this background of reaching the identity they have strived for, in some
yeah,
cases, their entire lives?
of course they can. I mean, I've written recently about the hero's journey and REBT, and how one of the things that we do as human beings is we go on this hero's journey. And there's other ways to describe, there's other analogies and metaphors we could use to describe the journey of life. One of them is hero's journey. And, after the resurrection, the hero returns with the treasure, with the wisdom, whatever analogy we want to use. Sometimes it's literal treasure, sometimes it's wisdom or some kind of insight. And then the job of the hero is to have social utility, to help
Mm,
people. So one of the ways in which people can redefine and reorient themselves post-career, after, when they decide to transition, often what you'll see is that they make their life's person about helping others. Now,
mm,
sometimes that keeps them attached to that domain that they've done for so many years. Sometimes it moves them away from that domain in a more meta level. For example, okay, my job has been leadership in an insurance company for 40 years, let's say. Well, I'm going to now go and talk to groups about leadership. It might have nothing
mm.
to do with insurance, but the meta learning is I've learned how to lead effectively and the challenges of leading, and I can pass that on. I can have some kind of social utility. That's a way of doing that still maintains a vocation, if you like. There's obviously dozens of ways you could do it that isn't vocational and is just about you passing on what you've learned to other people. So that is often a route, and that is at the end of the hero's journey, which is the hero's journey. To me, captures the human experience quite nicely, and it's interesting that comes at the end of that journey.
Yeah,
Um, so yeah, of course you can redefine and realign, but it's just not easy, and it just
yeah,
takes a bit of creative thinking and sometimes help from others to be able to do that.
yes. And then also, on the positive note, like when we go through something that we do not want to go through, and this is on a positive note, I'm not going
Good.
to
Hope so.
dive in the other head, but there are kind of three phases in that the phase number one is, why did this happen to me, in kind of a sense of maybe panic and negative emotions and very strong experience. And that is probably not the phase that another person can come in and say that, well, you will learn from this and so forward,
Mhm.
because that is like when all the emotions are up and you kind of need to go process them at their own pace. But then the second phase is, again, question, why did this happen to me? But maybe in some time that it comes more through interest, that, okay, well, I had this experience and it's actually quite interesting that why did I as an individual go through this? And then the third phrase, why did this happen to me, more from the sense of gratitude after a respectable amount of time, that
Mm.
we kind of go through surges of personal development, usually after the toughest of our times. That is
Yeah.
like the point when a person develops, because also the sense of our personal development isn't a stable, steady thing that would be linear throughout our lives. There can be a time that we're not really developing at all, and then suddenly there's a surge that we really do need to find new ways of doing things and developing ourselves. And usually that is triggered by adversity, that we reach another version of ourselves that is a bit more wise and
Mm.
capable of kind of investing attention and awareness that helps them and helps others also in the long run. Yes.
Nice.
So
Okay.
I
Let's finish there because it's positive.
yes, I
Yeah.
was
Don't
just
give me
saying
an
that, okay,
opportunity to bring this down.
I'm going to finish here before I kind of turn the coin again to the
Fine.
other side. So, thank you again for the talk, and also for the listeners that we're going to be doing other conversations on the aspects of the mind and psychology and these high stress, high performance environments, and also coming from the psychological aspect, but also I think a very human approach to it, as we are considering the different elements at play. So, yes.
Sounds good. Thank you. Thanks, everybody. See you at the next one.